Welcome to Brand Saving the Planet. I'm Kelly Rogan, and this is the podcast where we talk to startup founders working to make this world a better place, to learn from their journey and help you grow your own impact startup.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us, Sam. So I'd love to get started and kind of hand it over to you to provide an introduction into really simply who you are, where you're located, what you're working on, and what you're passionate about.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much for having me. So my name is Sam Shelby. I am a senior UX designer with an agency called Whitespace in Edinburgh in Scotland. And then we're part of a much larger international network called Dentsu. And I've been working here for about 5 years now. Before that, I did my undergrad and actually high school in the United States in Oregon. And
really?
So I've done a little bit of traveling, and then I got into UX because I did my undergrad in industrial design, found that I wasn't particularly good at making furniture, and so I ended up moving into something digital, which is much more forgiving. I kind of did a little bit of research, and then after that, specifically did some more projects on UX. I've been doing that for the last 5 years. And then I got into the kind of sustainable web design stuff. I read a really, really good book by a guy called Tom Greenwood, I believe his name is. And he wrote a book called Sustainable Web Design through A Book Apart, which they do some fantastic publications. And he kind of gave an intro as to what it was and why it mattered and the impact that it has. And since then, it's become something of a passion for me, in addition to the fact, I've always been kind of into green stuff. I did a couple of years ago, I went for a whole year without buying anything new, which was quite good fun. It's just like a personal experiment. And then I did a little bit with Extinction Rebellion when they had one of their big kind of Occupy, not London, not the first time, but the second time. So I camped outside of Westminster Abbey. So that's me in a bit of a nutshell. But yeah, the eco-friendly thing has been a large part of my life for a good few years now, and I'm really happy to have been able to find a way to express that in a professional setting as well.
Yeah, I think there's a big movement of people really trying to, because in the end, I feel like really every single career, I feel like from lawyers to accountants to furniture, I feel like everyone can apply their skills to helping, make this planet a better place. So, and interesting that you had mentioned furniture. I actually feel like it does make sense. It's kind of like a physical user experience, right? Now you're taking it to the digital setting. So
totally.
Interesting. So, and in terms of like making, sustainable web design, I think that this is really still a topic that is really up and coming. I think sustainability in general, right? People kind of think about, not using plastic bags and things, but the amount of time, all the even like watching Netflix, does have a carbon footprint. So how, in terms of sustainable web design, how would you kind of summarize that in a short term, and then we'll dive into the specific bits between hosting and design, UX, all of that.
Yeah, totally. You're absolutely right. It's kind of a weird topic that you wouldn't necessarily think about, right? How does code impact my carbon footprint? It's clear, when you drive a car or when you buy something new, like there's physical impacts, and so it kind of makes sense. But code is a bit of a weird one. So I guess to put it in really broad terms, so whenever you store data or send data or load data onto a device like a laptop or a mobile phone, all of that uses electricity. So whether that's the place that's kind of hosting your servers, which is where your website lives, or the telecommunications networks that send a website from a host to your phone and then actually loading it up on your phone, all of that uses electricity, which is ultimately what kind of where the greenhouse gas and where the emissions comes from. Because actually, believe it or not, the web uses about 1% of the world's electricity and contributes about 4% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. So it's a really big thing. And as you say, I think a lot of people can attest to the fact that we've all been watching quite a bit more Netflix over lockdown. So it does actually form a really big part of our lives. And as it continues to grow, we need to make sure that it's not having an oversized impact on the planet. So in terms of like how you actually get to be sustainable web design, and I'll talk about lots of the methods kind of in a bit more detail, but we look at where websites are hosted, how we send them across networks, and how we actually build them in order to make all of that more efficient and therefore have less of an impact at the end result.
Okay, amazing. And so can we kind of break it off into like specific examples of like, starting from the hosting, which I think everyone understands, and then into even in design, like I know from my basic knowledge, I think, I know that there's certain things like video that's just heavier on the website that would take longer to load, right? That affects SEO negatively. And then I assume would also maybe have a larger carbon footprint. So how can you, if you have to have a video on your website or, specific more or less design requirements, how can you do that in a more sustainable way?
Totally. So I guess there's a few things, and I think maybe first it's worth going over a kind of quick explainer maybe of how the internet works in general, because it's always useful.
That is, what, I still think it's magic.
So if you imagine checking out a library book, well, the internet actually works very similarly. So if you go to a library, you go to the front desk, you say, "Hey, can I have Charlie and the Chocolate Factory?" And they'll go, "Okay, yeah, we'll go and look in the back." And then once they find it, they'll bring it back to you, and then you get Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, and you get to read it. That's actually very similar to how kind of we do stuff on the internet. When you type in catpajamas.com onto your phone then sends out a signal, much like you going to a library, to the rest of the internet saying, "Hey, who's got catpajamas.com?" And then there's kind of a big search to see where it is, and then it gets sent back to your phone. But as you can imagine, there are a few different kind of points along that journey where things can take more time or load more slowly. So the first one to think about is when you're actually going to that library. If the library is really far away from you, or the book Charlie and the Chocolate Factory is all the way in the back of the library, things take a long time to get to you. Now, the internet equivalent of that is if you have a web host, if your hosting provider is far away from your end users, then that physical distance that a signal has to travel, it takes a lot longer. Now, that's kind of unfortunate for two reasons. The first one is obviously that actually takes longer for the page to load, which, as you say, impacts negatively on your SEO and impacts negatively on your user journey. But also that distance requires more energy for the actual information, whether it's a website or a book, to actually travel. So that's kind of one of the first things that we think about. And I'll talk about some methods as to how you can solve that problem later on. Another thing that you can think about is the actual size of the thing that you're trying to get. So Charlie and the Chocolate Factory is, it's a nice, small, compact book. It's easy to read, easy to carry and move around. But if you were asking your librarian for a set of 12 volumes of an encyclopedia, that would take a lot longer to get because they're big and heavy and clunky and would use a lot of energy to carry over to you. The same is exactly true on the website. The more stuff that you have on a web page, the more energy is required to get it from the server to your end device. And again, that uses more electricity. So it becomes less efficient and less sustainable. And again, it's also slower. So those are so I guess thinking about that analogy, you can then start to think about what the solutions are to those problems. So one of the things that you can do is to move your hosting provider or a copy of your website closer to your end users. And the way that it's typically done is called a content delivery network, or a CDN. And essentially what that does is it takes a copy of your website and it puts it a little bit closer to your end user. So it distributes it on servers all of the way around the world. So if you have a user in the UK and a website in China, you're not sending a signal from China to the UK. Actually, what you're doing is taking a copy of that website in China, putting it in, say, France, and then the user is only ever going from the UK to France to get that connection. Or if you think about it in the library example, that might be like the librarian putting 10 copies of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory all of the way around the library, so that no matter where you are in the library, there's always a good copy to hand. So that's kind of one example. Another thing I guess that you can do, and maybe taking again a little bit of a step back before you start on the whole journey of how to make your website more efficient, is actually to do a bit of a benchmark of how it's doing at the moment. And so there are some really useful tools, and I'm sure we can provide links in the show notes of the podcast as to how you can do this. And the two tools are websitecarbon.com and EcoPing. So that's ECOPING. And what these tools do is you just type in your website URL, and then it runs through a little bit of a speed check, or it's not a speed check, it's a sort of efficiency check. And it then spits out a number and tells you how much carbon is being emitted every time a user actually loads that page. And so that's a really useful way of gauging how you're doing at the moment and then where you can improve, because otherwise you might implement all of these changes and not actually know whether it's made a big difference. So I'd always definitely start with doing a benchmark. The next thing you can do is actually looking at the energy that your hosting provider is using. So going back to that, to my library analogy again, keeping the lights on in a library and keeping the books at a nice temperature so that they don't get messed up, that uses electricity. Again, exactly the same is true of a hosting provider. So it takes about as much electricity to keep the lights on as it does to keep your servers cool. And actually, some of the biggest data centers in the world use about as much electricity as Salt Lake City in Utah. So there's you can imagine that they're sucking up a whole lot of power. So what you want to make sure is that your hosting provider is running on entirely or mostly green energy, right? And there are some easy ways that you can do this. So one of them is to check, there's another really useful website called the Green Web Foundation. And you can go on that website and find your hosting provider and see whether or not they are actually accredited. The other thing that you can do is actually just go and ask them and just say, hey, who is providing your electricity? Where is it coming from? Because that kind of storage where your website lives, that is a huge, huge part of your overall carbon footprint. So that's kind of in terms of storage and a little bit in terms of the kind of transferring data across a network. But as you mentioned, the other really big part of this is actually how much data you're transferring, how big that book is, how much is getting moved around. And so there are lots of different ways that you can tackle this problem. The first one, as you mentioned, is to look at video. So video is a big part of the internet, and streaming it does take a lot of energy. But what you can do is make sure that you're using a hosting provider that has sort of good green credentials. From what I have seen, and I think the jury's out a little bit on this one, YouTube is a little bit better than Vimeo because YouTube is owned by Google. Google actually does have pretty good green credentials. And also, I guess you're leveraging their compression abilities, which are going to be much greater than something like an embedded player that comes out of, say, WordPress or Craft or any other CMS. So that's one thing you can do with video. Another thing is also just to make sure that you're not using it unnecessarily. So sometimes we like to have really cool, really cool kind of introductory videos or kind of flashy things happening in the background. You want to make sure that those are only being served to users that actually have the capabilities. So making sure that they're not being served on mobile, for instance. Another thing to do is make sure that they are actually providing some purpose to the users, because ultimately, again, if that makes your website slow down a little bit, that can really impact both their experience and ultimately your conversion. I think I read somewhere the other day that an increase in 0.1 in a tenth of a second can reduce conversion by something like 6%. So if you imagine that that's happening over potentially on an e-commerce site, that can really have an impact. So yeah, using video intentionally, and then also making sure you're leveraging some of the kind of larger platforms' ability to host it and compress it in a kind of efficient way. Another one is Imagery. So obviously images, photos, illustrations all make for a nice, rich, interactive web experience. And you definitely want to have visuals on your website because they help to drive engagement. Makes perfect sense, right? But they also are really big in terms of file sizes. So there's a few different things that you can do. Again, just like videos, make sure that you're not just putting them in a bunch of different places just because they look nice. Make sure that they are kind of used intentionally, and that you have and that you're not trying to overload the page with them. Another thing that you can do is make sure that you're always compressing images before you upload them. There's some really good tools out there. Image Optim is one of them. Tiny PNG is another one, where you can, as I say, make sure that before you actually upload them to your website, they're nicely compressed, so they're not really big files. And then another thing you can do if you're actually still in the stage of designing your website is to think about what kind of images you like. So different image styles will have different, I guess, file sizes with them. So you can imagine if you look at the photograph behind me, this is a beautiful, nice, detailed photograph. It's probably going to be a pretty big image because there's a lot of detail there. However, if we were to take the same image and actually make it in an illustration style where we used fewer colors and kind of bigger blocks, we could potentially get that image to be a lot smaller. So you could always potentially challenge your designer to say, hey, actually, why don't you consider maybe not using photographs or trying to find an illustration style that's going to be, that we can get to a really nice small file size. So those are some things that you can do in terms of images as well. Let's see, what else is there? Another thing that you can actually do is think about the typefaces that you use, so the fonts. Again, when you're designing a website, a lot of the time we like to use nice, different decorative typefaces because those really give your brand a particular look and feel and can obviously convey a kind of a particular style or tone of voice. And that's fantastic. But at the same time, sometimes there's lots of hidden stuff in type files that you don't actually need. So for instance, you might be loading a type file that has 5 or 10 different languages in it, when actually your website is only ever going to be served in one language. So what you can do is get your designer, I know it's crazy, right? So what you can do is get a designer to have a look through the type file. There's another service called Font Squirrel that's quite good. And you can go through and actually remove the unnecessary characters so that you're just serving it again in the most efficient way.
What about those that do have different languages? Like, is there a way, that, for example, if you have an IP address in Spain, for example, then you only get it in Spanish, and would that then be more sustainable, or to have the option to click through? Is there a way?
So this is a really interesting one. I was actually chatting with another developer friend about this. I think in theory, the answer would be yes, because ultimately what you're doing is choosing to serve a typeface based on, I guess it would be, based on an IP address. Now, I guess typically, I think that would involve loading up a different style sheet. So I think it gets a bit technical, but in theory, yes, what you could do is have 2 different files for 2 different audiences. I guess it's not exactly the same, but something that's also similar that we sometimes do with images is if you imagine when you're loading a web page on a laptop, it's obviously at a different aspect ratio, right? You've got a big wide rectangle versus if you have a mobile device, which is kind of long and tall. And so a lot of the times when we design websites, we might have nice big landscape images on desktop, but actually when they get to mobile, we make them long and tall instead. So what we do in order to make that process more efficient is rather than take that big image and then just crop it down so that we're only showing kind of the middle rectangle, we actually upload a different image with a kind of different aspect ratio and say, when a user is accessing on desktop, load one image. When they're accessing on mobile, load a different image. And again, that's one of those kind of efficiency tricks that you can do to reduce the page size. And again, especially on mobile, it becomes like a really big, it becomes a particularly important issue because people might be on, kind of different data providers, or they might not have particularly quick phones and so on. So yeah, that's another thing that you can do.
Okay, so in terms of, looking at all of the different aspects, once, a company does take those steps and starts to improve, and they actually become proud of their hopefully offset, carbon footprint, how do you suggest the communication of this? Is there, I feel like in the end, there are certain certifications like B Corp, but is there anything like that for a website, or kind of what are you seeing as like a really credible way to share this information?
Totally. So I guess there's a few different ways of doing it. And again, it's always worth saying up front that as a company, you want to be really careful not to come across as kind of greenwashy, because people can, and I think more often are becoming aware of how to kind of catch people out. And I know that consumers can react really negatively to greenwashing. So in terms of things that you can actually do, the first one is to just, I guess, talk about your current emissions. So if you've done a benchmark, you can go, okay, we started out at 7 grams of carbon per page. We've now got this down to 3 grams. So that's a really easy, very measurable, very clear thing that you can say to your users. And actually, one of the things that I think Website Carbon does is it also tells you where, roughly speaking, where you rank in terms of the rest of the internet. So I think it'll give you a score that says you are emitting 7 grams of carbon. This is worse than 60% of the internet. So once you've done that benchmark and you get to a good place, you can then say, we've made this reduction. And also we are, according to Website Carbon, we are now in this percentile. We're in the top 20% of websites. Another thing that you can do that's also offered through them is there's a little JavaScript kind of badge that you can stick in your website footer that says, this is how much carbon is generated by this particular page. So that's another nice kind of clear thing that you can do to communicate it. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing that I would personally recommend, and I'm starting to kind of see this more often, and certainly recommending it to my clients, is to begin thinking about having a sustainability page on your website in the same way that you have a privacy page and an accessibility page and a cookie page. And again, what that kind of a page would consider would be what your emissions are at the moment, where you started from, and if you had a benchmark so you can show improvement, how you went about measuring those emissions, what you did to reduce them, and then what else you're working on as a brand to be more sustainable. I think what's important is to take into account that digital sustainability is fantastic. I highly recommend it, and I think we should all be doing it. But it should be happening within the context, hopefully, of kind of looking at sustainability holistically from your business point of view. If you're an e-commerce business, what kind of packaging do you use? What kind of returns policy do you have? Are you selling things that are actually sustainable? And so on and so forth. So I think looking at measuring your website, having that little counter there, looking at a sustainability page, and then, as I say, looking at how you're doing sustainability in the rest of your business and maybe providing a little bit of information on that as well.
Absolutely. We just actually recorded a podcast a couple of days ago with an investor from a sustainability VC fund, and they talked a lot about the whole idea where everything you do has an impact, and so you can't just look at one little micro thing. You have to look at the global impact. And it's interesting how you mentioned that it's a good idea to kind of put and map out where you've come, where you're at, and where you're going in terms of sustainability. Because we all have a carbon footprint, right? Every single day. We're living, breathing creatures, right? We have to live and survive and do things. But I think that education piece and kind of inspiring other businesses and other just individuals to take action is really something that kind of ends up to be your full environmental impact. And I listened to a podcast. I feel like every time I record a podcast, I mention this podcast. The How to Save a Planet by Gimlet Media. They're amazing.
Oh yeah, love it.
And they're not paying me for this, I swear. They're amazing, but they kind of talk about the real environmental impact we have sometimes can be the sharing, right? That communication piece of actually like that, snowball effect. So I think that's kind of one of our next topics to move into is how much environmental impact can it really have, right? What is that like final end of the day impact?
You touched on some really interesting points there, just in terms of, I guess, the impact that you have, and also maybe the reason that you're doing this. I guess there are a few really good things few really good benefits to consider when you're actually trying to make your website more sustainable. I mean, the first one is fantastic. You've made your website more sustainable. You're reducing your impact. The other thing is that the kind of a lot of the tips and tricks I've mentioned, and there are plenty more that I've written about and have kind of talked on. Those actually make for a better website experience. Ultimately, they make your website faster. They're the kind of the best practices for building good websites anyway. So they're better for your users. And then the other thing is actually just when you start to talk about being a sustainable brand, these are the types of, I guess we're just seeing overall in the business world, people are moving in that direction. So from a customer point of view, 66% of customers will pay more for green goods over normal ones. I think in the UK, it's something like 1/3 of employees will move to a job that is better for the planet, and they will even take a pay cut for it.
Yep.
And then the other one of my other favorite quotes to mention is there's a guy called Larry Fink, who is the CEO of BlackRock, which is the biggest asset manager in the world. They manage something like $8 trillion of assets. So it's an insane amount of money across companies. So he knows what he's talking about. And he was saying, as of 2020, that the companies that they manage, that they're seeing perform the best, are the ones that are driven by some kind of purpose, and oftentimes that's a social impact thing. So and sustainability is one of the big things. So there's a lot of benefits to from a kind of business point of view, as well as a planet point of view, for actually implementing sustainable web design practices. But your original question though was how much of an impact can it have? And so there's quite a nice case study that I like to share. And it's probably been shared quite a lot, at least within the sustainable web community. There's a guy called Danny Van Kooten, who's a developer, I believe, in the Netherlands, and he built an email plugin for WordPress websites. So if you send emails through a service called MailChimp, I believe he was the one that actually wrote that plugin. And what he did over lockdown was he said, "Hey, how can I reduce my impact?" And because this plugin is actually used on a whole bunch of websites, he said, well, if I can make this more efficient every time it's loaded on the website, then I will reduce my impact a little bit. So he took out 20 kilobytes worth of JavaScript, which is basically nothing. It's a few lines of code. And as a result of doing that, because that code, that plugin is used many times every day, he ended up saving something like 3,000 kilos of carbon every month, which, to put it in perspective, is the same as flying from New York to Amsterdam 5 times. So he saved 5 flights a month every month, just from doing what is effectively a tiny change. So if you imagine that you have a website that's visited by a few hundred or a few thousand people every month, these small changes actually add up. And the benefit is you only have to do them once for them to have a really lasting impact. So I would definitely consider if you run your website or you have some power to affect change, these are things that you really can do that do have a measurable impact, not only from kind of an efficiency point of view, but as you said earlier, Kelly, it's about kind of communicating the fact that this is something that you're interested in and becoming part of a kind of a voice in that movement. When I was doing Extinction Rebellion, one of the things that they liked to talk about was the fact that it takes, and I think they said it was like, if you can get 3% of a population on board about anything, then you have a movement, and it starts to actually tip the balance. And I certainly think that we're getting to that 3% globally, but certainly adding your voice on this particular issue again will start to affect change both now and hopefully in the future.
Absolutely. I think that's the key. The way you described it, I think, was perfect, is that we need to, and I think this has been a challenge, and actually we just reshared something today talking about how the propaganda and the whole communication around climate change, around sustainability, needs to change, because it's not about saving the animals and all these poor little innocent animals. It's about saving ourselves, right? And it is possible. It's like if we just start that movement, and it becomes this massive snowball effect. So I think it really is changing that. And that brings me to my next question that we're starting to ask in every podcast episode, is that there's a lot of doom and gloom around these topics. So I want to focus on more of the positive side. So what are you most excited about for the future of our planet?
Ultimately, if we get to a place where we can develop, if we can reinvest in our world, it's really sad that it's taken us destroying the planet to realize that we should try and keep the planet. But ultimately, if we can save it and avoid the worst of the kind of potential outcomes, hopefully we will end up in a much better, much fairer place. That would be the really optimistic side of me. Realistically, is that going to happen? Not sure. But we will. But I can certainly keep my fingers crossed that's where we will end up, and that certainly doesn't mean we shouldn't stop fighting for that ultimate future.
Exactly. Yeah, and there's been a lot of talk, and there's a whole big topic on how we cannot possibly save this planet and move to a really sustainable place without equality. We need to kind of bring everyone we can't just like shove some people aside just because there happens to be, you know, a border there and they're from another place. It's like we all have to go to the same place in the same direction. I think that's a really interesting answer. How we need to, it needs to be a fairer place. And I think that's kind
Absolutely.
of what I'm, you know, so passionate and interested about, is that businesses should exist, you know, because they are sustainable. They're not depleting resources or treating people poorly. You know, it's like they should exist. The top ones that I envision in 50 years will be those who truly walk the talk, you know, that actually show up and do things. And maybe their profit margins aren't nearly as high as these other companies, but they probably shouldn't be, right? It's like we need to, you know, profit, you know, it's the triple bottom line, right? People, planet, profit. It's not just profit. It can never be just profit because they will never survive in the long term.
Absolutely.
So,
Absolutely.
interesting. Well, I want to wrap up kind of on another topic that is more focused a bit on the community piece, since we really work hard at supporting community. And I think with all of the topics that we've gone through today, you know, even from like just like the website, building a sustainable website, you can't do that alone, right? You need to have like all the pieces in place. You need to have the hosting. You need to have, you know, all that support. So I am curious to hear how community has supported you on the journey. You know, I know you've been in the US for a bit and we're in, you know, different career choices for a bit, but how has community been an integral part of this path for you?
So I guess there's maybe community at different points. So I started out my kind of path into environmentalism through Extinction Rebellion, which I guess is a huge community in and of itself. I'm no longer part of the organization, but I guess that was an initial start, and so much of their founding principles are around the impact that climate change will have on communities. Since actually then moving specifically into sustainable web design, one of the biggest communities that I've been a part of is the climateaction.tech community. So they've got a really big Slack group that I've been a part of, and they've got, and I think that was how we connected, wasn't it? So, and they've got really good communities specifically around kind of web performance and web design. And so in writing a few of the articles that I've written in the last few months, I've been able to kind of bounce ideas off folk within that, which has been great. I guess the other part of this as well is that I'm a huge believer in the kind of open sourcing of information around environmentalism. It was an idea that I'm absolutely stealing from Tom Greenwood, who wrote the book on sustainable web design. But one of the things that he was saying is that it shouldn't be, just because you can do sustainable web design doesn't mean that should be your business offering. I guess it's not a value proposition. It's just part of your service. And so when I say kind of doing things open source and kind of publishing your methodology, I guess that's another part of a community as well, is that you're saying this information is not my own, it belongs to the rest of the internet community to do with as they will. So I guess that's another part of how community has impacted my work specifically in this space, and I guess making it available to others.
Yeah, kind of sharing that knowledge and helping everyone to, I guess, lessen the learning curve, right?
Absolutely.
Wonderful. And let's wrap up here. I think we've had some really good information. We'll share all of the tools and URLs in the description of the podcast. Cool. But I'd love to wrap up with kind of how our community can help support you. So what would you kind of final call to action for how we could support you on your journey and your mission?
Make your website more sustainable, then tell me about it. So you can, if you want to get in touch, so you can do so via my agency website. So that's whitespacers.com. We'll include a link to that below. Feel free to send me an email. It's my first name, a full stop, and then my last name at whitespacers, so sam.selby@whitespacers.com. And then if you want to connect on climateaction.tech, the Slack group, feel free to reach out there as well. I've been part of the kind of greener web performances channel, and then also I've been writing a few bits on their kind of internal internal kind of database and kind of guides. So any of those would be great. I would love to hear how you have made your website more sustainable, what you've done, what's worked for you, what hasn't, and so on. And then, let me know.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for your time today. And we look forward to changing the world to be on sustainable webs.
Love it. Thank you very much, Kelly. Really appreciate the time.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks for tuning in. We'll talk to you soon. Brands Saving the World is an original podcast and Ola Impact production. Our host is Kelly Rogan, and we appreciate all feedback and podcast ideas sent to the email hello@olaimpact.com.